I'm John Abel from the County Historical Association, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you here this evening for this second installment of our Third Thursday lecture series. I want to thank all the folks here at the Barracks for hosting us this evening, and I also want to acknowledge the staff at Monroe County Historical Association for the wonderful job that they have done to go out and find all these wonderful and comfortable venues for us to be in. And not only that, but they go out and they find interesting speakers who are knowledgeable and speak on interesting topics. Now notice how I segue right into this. And speaking of interesting people, here is my friend Peter Gonze to talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps and the wonderful job that was done by that organization in the United States and also right here locally. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Peter Gonze.
That's very kind and somewhat premature. I'm happy to be here, and I'm delighted to speak about this topic. I was asked earlier, how did I become interested in the Conservation Corps and the Promised Land? And it was quite by accident. At our Paradise Historical board meeting, we were talking about different topics, and one of the members of the group said, well, we should do a topic about the CCC. Who's interested? And I apparently looked up at the wrong time. So I did give a version of this presentation last August. And in preparing for the presentation, because I wanted to do some research and be somewhat knowledgeable, because I figured there'd be a lot of people who know about this topic. So I decided I was going to take a trip up to the Promised Land and go visit the Masker Museum, which was how I first became interested in this topic. I took John Abel with me, as it turns out. And he didn't realize that I was on a research trip. He thought we were up there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and we'd be leaving. Well, an hour later, I'm still taking pictures and doing research, talking to the docent, and he was getting impatient. But he's forgiven me. So, as I say, I'm delighted to be here to talk about this topic. For years, I lived in Massachusetts, up in Boston. And we would drive down to our place here in the Poconos. And of course, we come down 84, get off at 390. We'd pass through the Promised Land, always so beautiful. We've hiked there. My daughter and her husband have been there with their RV. It's just a beautiful place. I did not know until I learned about the Masker Museum, about the connection with the CCC. And we'll talk more about that. The Masker Museum, and you'll hear more about that, it's a small museum, and it really captures a lot of the history of the Civilian Conservation Corps at the Promised Land. And the statue that's in the middle of this screen here, the statue of the boy with the axe in hand, is symbolic of the CCC. It has been presented at a number of different locations where there were CCC camps that are still have a museum or have some kind of a function. So we'll talk more about that later. So anytime you're telling a story and you're talking about, the production, you need to know the cast. And so here's a list of the cast that will be coming up, and there'll be a few cameos from a few other people. We have the Lenapes, we have Mr. and Mrs. Frisbee, Dr. Jones, the Shakers, the Roosevelts, Governor Pinchot, Smoot Hawley, the young men, of course, and Henry Masker. So, a brief history, because as you know, you're all interested in history. History needs to be understood in context, right? So, going back 10,000 years ago, the area was inhabited by nomadic Aboriginal tribes, and eventually they became a society, the Lenape Indians, and they were hunter-gatherers. So they were known to use the area around the Promised Land for hunting and fishing. The first known, I guess, Western settlers were Huldah and Hiram Frisbee, and they settled in the Promised Land in 1840. Between the 1840s and the 1850s, the area was used primarily as an extraction industry, as a resource. People were harvesting timber, they were pulling bark for tanning, they were harvesting bluestone, harvesting ice in the winter. It was all about extraction. And then in 1870, Dr. Joseph Jones purchased lands, a lot of land, and he's running a massive timbering enterprise. He had a short-lived partnership with the Shakers, who were up in Lebanon, New York. And they worked together because the Shakers were using wood for their crafts and what have you. But there was no Shakers living here. They were basically contracting. The partnership with the Shakers dissolved. At that time, they owned about 10,000 acres. And they were using it, as they say, for their crafts, but also using it for shipbuilding and railroad ties. The Shakers wound up selling in 1899 to a gentleman by the name of William Kelly, who sells to Nettie Whites in 1901. So in a very short period of time, we have a lot of things going on up here, primarily using the resources. And here we have Nettie Whites then buying the property in 1901. So the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was very forward-thinking, and they were purchasing land throughout the state. And between 1902 and 1904, they were buying land in this area. Pricing ranged from 18 cents an acre to $2 an acre. A little bit different today. In 1905, the Pennsylvania government, the state government, established the Promised Land as the 4th state park in Pennsylvania. It was at that time, having been heavily forested, largely a hunting and fishing camping destination. And here we have a couple of the boys either just getting ready for a hunting expedition or just having returned at one of the hunting camps, the many hunting camps that were up here. Again, in context, we have the market crash of 1929. You may have read about it, it was in all the papers, or maybe you saw about it in your history books. And of course, it was devastating. It really upended the entire economy, not only of the country here, but across in Western Europe as well. Now, here's a crash course on the Depression. So we have Black Thursday that occurred on October 24th, 1929. We have the Smoot-Hawley Act, which is introduced in 1930. Now, Smoot-Hawley was a tariff act, which is largely considered to have exacerbated the Depression. It was meant to protect businesses that were struggling here, but of course, when you have tariffs and you put tariffs on other countries, they hit you back with other tariffs. So by the 1930s, by June of 1930, we have the Dust Bowl beginning, and we have farms being destroyed. They were taking up the grass, the prairie grass, and replacing it with other things that didn't have deep roots. So when they have the windstorms, they have the dust, and there was a drought spell. So, you know, you had throughout the country a lot of environmental issues. In 1933, FDR takes office, and the New Deal is introduced. And then by 1938, just prior to World War II, we had the economy starting to recover. But back to the crash. 25% of employable people were out of work. I mean, absolutely devastating. And it didn't get any better, and as they say, Smoot-Hawley made it even worse. So we had, as I said, the Dust Bowl, unemployment, bank failures, and you can see here in the slide on the right that there's a bunch of people just standing around. This is taken from a newspaper clipping. Each one of these folks has a label on them. A carpenter, a cook, a welder, painter, and so on, all sort of identifying who was out of work. Note, there was no politicians. So we had bank runs and we had unemployment. In this cartoon, the man at the end is saying, is this the bread line or is it a run on the bank? And we have Will Rogers, the famous humorist, who said that we will be known as the first country in history to go to the poorhouse in an automobile. So FDR is elected in 1932. That's 3 years after the crash began. So people were going through a lot of troubled times during that period of time. Massive unemployment, the dirty 30s. And he was inaugurated into the presidency on March 4th, 1933, and brought in the New Deal. So the major programs of the New Deal were focused on relief, reform, and recovery. And there's a number of different programs that were introduced. You can see the abbreviations here. The one at the bottom, the ECW, was the Emergency Conservation Works Program, which was eventually renamed the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. Conservation and reforestation. I've sort of set the stage in terms of what the need was. You had problems throughout the country, environmental issues, but the timbering impact in the country was immense. From the time that the colonists first came to the New World, where it was estimated that there was 800 million acres of virgin forests, by 1933 that was reduced to 100 million acres. And if you've ever seen pictures of this area, there was a lot of timbering that was done. And there's many areas that had no trees whatsoever. And the Promised Land was one of those areas. So here we have Governor Pinchot and the Roosevelts. And it's interesting that we have Teddy, who was a major environmentalist, conservationist, interested in national parks, restoration. And he appointed Pinchot as the head of the first head of the U.S. Forestry Service. So Teddy Roosevelt was leading the conservation movement. And then later on, Pinchot becomes governor of Pennsylvania. He's the one that was really promoting the parks in Pennsylvania. And he's working with FDR now with the New Deal, advising him in terms of things that could be done. You might say that they were early adopters. Governor Pinchot initiated a relief program with men working in the parks and forests throughout Pennsylvania. He really started that program. While FDR was governor of New York, he initiated a small program similar to what Pinchot had, and it became the model for the CCC. The CCC was created with a one-page executive order on April 5th, 1933. And what was it? It was one of the earliest New Deal programs. It was a work relief program targeted to young men. And it was, the goal of it was to improve America's public lands and forests and to provide training and educational opportunities for young men. Here's the alphabet soup of the New Deal. Works Progress Administration, Civil Works Administration, Farm Security, National Industrial Recovery Act, and Social Security. That's the one I'm most familiar with. And the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a collaborative effort, and when you think about government activity today and compare it to with what happened back in 1933, it's pretty amazing. There was 5 federal departments that were involved in collaborating on this program: Labor, Interior, Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service, and the Army. And the states will be working, coordinating the programs locally. There were CCC camps that were established in all 50 states. Now, I know that in 1933 there were only 48 states, but I'm just using this as shorthand because there were programs in Hawaii and Alaska as well. By 1942, more than 4,000 camps had been established. It put over 3 million men to work and 8,500 women. In addition to that, they had foremen and they had LEMs. Those are local experienced men. And it was all supervised by the Army. So the way it worked, the reason they worked with the Army is because the Army had the infrastructure to deal with intake and recruiting, sanitation at camps, food, maintenance, discipline, payroll, transportation, and it was also seen as an opportunity to train young officers. Enrollment for the enrollees was for 6-month terms. They could do up to 3 enlistments. They could either decide to go home, or they could stay on or re-enlist. I mentioned that this was started with a 1-page memo, but there was another memo that was an internal cost review. And in this 1-page document, which is, you can see FDR's, well, you can make it out in the upper right-hand corner, his initials. And he's looking at the analysis of the cost of the program, to run the program. And he says that the total is $1.92 per person. And FDR's note at the top there says, this figure of $1.92, not including transportation or wages, is absurdly high. It must be greatly reduced. I don't know if it was reduced or not. The program went ahead. It was signed off on by Duncan Major, acting chief of staff, and it was approved by the director of the Emergency Conservation Program. So it went ahead. Recruiting, they were focused on men 18 to 23. It was also later included men, young men of 17. Primarily white men, unmarried. There were a few segregated camps for African Americans and for Native Americans. And there were camps for World War I vets. And there was a few veterans from the Spanish-American War who participated as well. They had to be unemployed, and their families had to be on assistance. And they had to be U.S. citizens, physically fit, and have at least 6 teeth. I don't know about you, but I'd really be interested in being in the committee meeting where that was discussed. As I say, it was focused primarily on young white males. There were 8,500 women who were enrolled for a short period of time. Just under 90,000 Native Americans who served on reservations. The 200,000 African Americans were only in camps in the north. The southern states did not want to have camps where the African Americans were getting the same wage as the young white workers were getting. And because this was a federal program and they had established the wages, that's the way it was going to be. And there was about 225,000 World War I vets who were participating as well, and they were in separate camps. The woman behind the New Deal was Frances Perkins. This is FDR's Secretary of Labor, and she was the first woman to serve as a cabinet secretary. She was a real advocate for the fact that, and this is a quote here from something she wrote, "The people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life." She got a nudge from Eleanor Roosevelt about doing something for women. And I think that was the genesis of the 8,500 women that participated. Frances Perkins was the driving force behind the New Deal in terms of organizing it, helping draft the legislation for it. She was a leading advocate throughout her life for industrial safety and workers' rights. So, here we have the induction process. So, the young men would volunteer, and they would be signed up. They would be inoculated against smallpox and typhoid, and then they'd be transported to various Army bases for conditioning, calisthenics, light work duty, and then they would have to pass a physical. 9% failed. But those who passed were enrolled as juniors in the program. And they were enrolled by company, by location. So again, you can see this, the workings of the military here in terms of the format for this. Compensation, $30 a month. 25 had to be sent home. Every 2 weeks, they received $2.50 for spending money. They got their room and board. They got medical. They got 2 weeks of vacation, several holidays, 2 sets of clothing, blue denim clothing for work, and old Army uniforms for dress programs. And at the end of their term, they got transportation home. So to give you some perspective, $1.92, as I mentioned, the cost. In today's dollars, that's about $50. That's about $50 in today's dollars. So you know, that puts a different light on it, but still, that's pretty cheap, I think, even in today's dollars. So the compensation was not great, but it was certainly more than these boys were making at home. They had to send money home to the family. It was dirty work, it was hard work, and for most of these kids, it was their first time away from home. But they wound up sending more than 72 million home to help their families, and that's in 1933 dollars. Their spending money was estimated to produce or to provide about $5,000 a month to the local economy, where they would, you know, buy things from small businesses in the area. So a typical day in the life of the CCC, it was run pretty much like the military. There was no saluting. The discipline wasn't quite as severe, but it was pretty well structured. They lived in barracks, they wore uniforms, they woke up to reveille, there was work call, sick call, and they described the food as simply scrumptious, which if you're coming from a home environment where you weren't getting a lot to eat, I guess that would be true. So on the left-hand panel, a typical day, 6 a.m. reveille, 6:15 roll call, 6:45 breakfast, 7:30 barracks inspection, 7:45 work projects, 12 noon lunch, 5 p.m. return to the camp, 6 p.m. dinner, and then it's followed by classes and recreation. So here we have a couple of pictures of them lining up for reveille in the morning. We have them on display here in their military uniforms for a group picture, and just reinforcing the fact that it was military oriented in terms of the style. Hard work. They called it Roosevelt's Tree Army, college in the woods. And here these pictures are from boys building roads up in the Promised Land, planting trees. There's one panel which you can't see real well where they're clearing snow from the roads. They had a lot of snow in those days. And it was definitely hard work. Here again, we have them lining up for chow, the chow bell with their canteens, and that's when they were getting their scrumptious food. So major accomplishments. Well, they put over 3 million men to work. It was training programs, because remember, with so many people, the primary breadwinners being out of work, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for a lot of young men to get training in trades or skills or anything. There was 4,500 camps across 50 states. They built or rebuilt parks and forests, and they planted over 3.5 billion trees. Now a little closer to home, the CCC in Pennsylvania. This map of Pennsylvania, all the dots that are on there are CCC camps that existed in Pennsylvania during the course of the program. So there was a lot. There was more camps here in Pennsylvania than in any other state except for California. So, Pennsylvania, over just under 200,000 men worked in CCC programs in Pennsylvania. There was 151 camps, as I said, number 2 in the US. 60 of those camps were in what they call the PA Wilds. In other words, the very rural areas. This area was part of the Pennsylvania wilds. Pennsylvania was among the first to open a camp. And the Promised Land area had almost been completely clear-cut by 1903. So there was a real need for this program. So Camp S-139 was the camp that's at the Promised Land. Again, military designation, the S stands for State Park. It was later called Promised Land, it was called the Promised Land Camp, later called Camp Pocono. So here we have the Cresco Station. Looks pretty much the same today as it did then. And this is an excerpt from a speech that was given many years later. And it says, on May 6, 1933, it was a cold, damp, rainy day as the train stopped in Cresco, PA, and company number 337 from Maryland boarded the trucks to the Promised Land State Park. It was disbanded in 1936, and they were replaced by company number 5463 from Alabama, followed by company 1399 from another camp in Edgemere, Pennsylvania. So here are the boys on their way into the camp. Not only was it called Roosevelt's Tree Army, it was also called the Colossal College of Calluses. But their motto was, we can take it. And indeed they did. So here's a picture of one of the first group, well, it was the first group at the camp at 139, opened in May of 33. Keep in mind that that was 1 month after the CCC was created and 2 months after FDR was inaugurated. I mean, to me, it's astounding that a program could be initiated, inaugurated, and up and running in that period of time. So this first company was basically boys from the Philadelphia area. The camp was formed, I guess the military camp was in Maryland, and that's how they got the Maryland designation. And at the camp in the Promised Land, there was 1,500 men who served between 33 and 1941. So, I don't know if you can see it, but there's one face there that's circled in red. And when I was up with John, talking to the docent, he took me over to this picture, which is in the front there. And he was talking to me about this first camp. And he pointed out that individual, whose name is Bob Butler, who happened to be from Barrett Township. And he was also this man's father-in-law. So it was just very interesting. The family stayed in the area. I'd like to go back and learn more about what his father did after the CCC. But it was just interesting, that Barrett connection. So here we have the new recruits. When they get to camp, they're usually given 2 sets of clothing, blue denim for work, and a fatigue suit. They always used Army material. And their first job, because remember, the first group that came up here, there was no cabins. So they pitched some tents, Army issue tents, and they set up camp, and their first job was to build cabins so that, when the next group would come in, well, by the time that winter rolled around, they had a place to stay. So here's some of the guys working. Some of them are just posing for a picture there. But again, hard work, low pay, miserable conditions, and more. These photographs are old photographs from some of the cabins that were built originally by the men when they first arrived there. Unfortunately, some of these cabins, well, the cabins that are in these pictures did not survive. But there were 3 buildings up there that survived, that are still from the time of the CCC. The blacksmith shop, the auditorium, and the administrative building, which is where the Masker Museum is held. And so those buildings are still the original buildings. They've been obviously fixed up and repaired over time. So training and education. Remember, when they come home after dinner, they have the opportunity to take some classes, to get a high school diploma. So the hard physical labor improved their physical conditioning, and they had opportunities to learn trades. Some of them got high school diplomas, some of them learned how to read, and they thrived here. But they learned all kinds of trades: cabinet making, reading plans, welding, cooking, driving. And here's a collection of badges. It was almost like Boy Scouts or Army, where they got badges for achieving certain levels of proficiency in their trades. And they were awarded high school diplomas as well. Military, absolutely. There's a recreation of the barracks up at the Massacre Museum, and looks pretty much what you'd expect in a military barracks. For recreation, they had sports teams, they had pool tables, they had dances where they invited the local girls. I'm sure a lot of the local men were not happy with that. They did plays, they had choruses. Invariably, within a group of about 200, there would be somebody who would be musically talented. And they would go to Greentown and Hawley for the shops and the local girls. So I'm done. So Camp Pocono, as I say, it opened May 6th, 1933, closed July 1st, 1941. They repaired the existing dam that was up there. They built 12 family cabins. They built shower houses, pit toilets. They built the park roads and trails, campsites, and those campsites were perpetuated, and many people still use many of the campsites today. Of course, they were expanded. They fought fires when needed. They cleared the roads in the winter, planted over 1 million trees in the Promised Land area, and they employed 1,500 men. Here's a picture of the first sign that was put up for the Promised Land and the boys that were in that first company. So they restored the depleted forests. They, overall, the CCC helped improve farming practices. The young men who left home had new experiences in the great outdoors. One of the biggest problems, because most of these boys came from some of the big cities on the East Coast. They were city boys. They weren't really used to the country or being away from home. So homesickness was a big issue. But it did give them skills, reading and writing, a sense of purpose. And the legacy that we enjoy today is what we call the Promised Land State Park. So, as I was doing the research, I came across a number of names of some of the locals, the local experienced men who worked at the camp. So some of these names are probably have descendants who are still in this area. I see Williams, I see Carlton, I see Silphy, and you may recognize other names as well. But I find it interesting that that it made such an impact on the area in terms of the income that the boys at the camp would spend locally and how that helped the local economy. So the Massacre Museum, it's a real treasure. If you have not been there, it's worth a visit. It's not large, but it has a lot of really interesting artifacts and a lot of information about the history of the CCC. It's essentially open just during the summer months, from Memorial Day to Labor Day. You should check ahead to make sure that there's somebody there staffing the building. It's also where the Nature Center is. So a word about Henry Massacre. He was one of the local experienced men. He was born in 1899 on Shiny Mountain Road. He was a forester and a fire warden. He actually went to Milford to meet with Governor Pinchot and asked for the job to work there as a foreman, and he got the job. He continued on in the park, and he and his wife ran the boat and bait concession for 60 years. They closed up in 1986. So he's a real bridge to the past. And here we have a gentleman, Tom France, who came to the 2001 CCC camp reunion. He spent 6 years at the camp, and he was one of those boys who rose up and became a craftsperson. He led a team, and he stayed on. So he grew up in Jim Thorpe, and I'm just going to read an excerpt from a speech that he gave at the dedication of that statue, the boy with the axe. And what he said was, "When I passed by the Cresco station on my way here, I could not believe it. I never thought I would see this place again. That was the start of my life in the Lord's Valley in paradise, the promised land. The statue of the CCC boy with an axe in his hand represents my footprints, along with the hundreds of other men who labored here at the promised land throughout the nation. The dedication of the statue at the Masker Museum will be our history book for all who enter and who continue to protect and preserve the legacy of Penn's Woods for future enjoyment. I am leaving my heart forever in the promised land. This place made me who I am today." So that's a tremendous tribute, I think, to the state. And here, today, Promised Land State Park is about 3,000 acres. It's surrounded by 12,000 acres of the Pennsylvania-Delaware forest land. I want to finish with this, and that is that I'm painfully aware that the mind can absorb no more than the seat can stand. John?
Good job. Good job, Peter. Thank you so much.